Mic check, 1, 2, 3, 4. Mic check, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Okay, welcome to the Board of Selectmen Affordable Housing Workshop that starting right now at 6:05, and I'm going to turn it over to Galen, who is the moderator for tonight.
All right, thank you, Select Board, for the opportunity to moderate tonight's discussion. My name is Galen Weidley. I'm the Director of Planning and Development for the town of Kennebunkport. Is an ongoing discussion between the Select Board, and in recent ordinance updates, it was discussed that you all want to delve really into a deep dive and learn the developer's perspective regarding affordable housing. And so I'm pleased to announce tonight that we have three panelists from across the state that would provide that insight and answer some of the questions that you have regarding affordable housing. So the layout for tonight, and thank you town residents for attending. What the layout tonight will be is we're going to have just a quick overview of bios of our panelists, and then I'm going to allow each of them to do a presentation, a little bit about what their organizations do, and also to give some perspective on affordable housing developments that they've dealt with across the state. And then I will be answering I will be asking the panelists with some questions that the Select Board and members of our committee have submitted prior, and then we'll open it up to any Q&A that people have in addition. Sound like a plan?
Sounds like
Good.
All right. So our panelists tonight, starting at the far end, we have John Egan. John is a Senior Program Officer for Strategic Initiatives at Genesis Fund. He expands the expert guidance Genesis provides throughout Maine and in northern New England to help communities overcome barriers and create affordable housing and other projects that support health and well-being and generate prosperity. Prior to joining Genesis, John's 30-plus years of community development experience included 20 years at CEI, Inc., as a housing developer and lender and as Chief Investment Officer. At Maine Housing, he was the manager of multifamily housing programs. John also has worked for nonprofit agencies in Alaska to develop and manage a variety of multifamily and special needs housing projects. And then I just also learned that John resides in Freeport and is the vice chair of the Freeport Town Council. So thank you for your service. Up next is Ryan Fecto, who serves in the newly formed role as Senior Officer of Policy and Planning at Avesta. As a member of Avesta's real estate development team, he supports Avesta's organizational advocacy efforts and work on municipal level coordination to move new affordable housing developments throughout key milestones. Prior to joining Avesta, Ryan was most recently a senior advisor for the Community Development and Strategic Initiatives for the Governor's Office of Policy, Innovation, and the Future, or GOPIF for short. During his tenure in the Maine legislature, he served as a speaker for the House of Representatives and served as the Maine House Assistant Minority Leader and the chair of the Committee on Labor, Commerce, Research, and Economic Development. Thank you for joining with us tonight, Ryan. And last but not least, we have Mark Wiesendower, is the Maine Housing's Director of Development and has been with Maine Housing since 2016. Previously, he was employed by HUD in Seattle, Washington, and Washington, D.C., where he was appointed as a Presidential Management Fellow. Mr. Wiesendower received a BS from the University of Southern Maine and an MBA from Seattle University. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
All right. So with that being said, I will hand it over to John if you want to give a quick presentation about the Genesis Fund.
Sure. Thanks for coming this evening, and nice to meet you all, and thank you for your service in leading your town. The slides we're going to see here shortly are really just to focus on how to get housing projects going, how to kind of organize thoughts and ideas and emotional momentum around responses to a housing shortage, which is acute in all 16 counties, and we haven't found a community yet that says, nope, we're okay. We don't need any help with housing. My colleague Mark and I go around the state doing these workshops, and so we get to hear and see a lot of different experiences and a lot of different challenges that are facing communities. Genesis Community Loan Fund is a nonprofit based in Brunswick. We are what's called a CDFI, which stands for Community Development Financial Institution. That's a mouthful, but it means that we are essentially a mission-aligned bank and lender in the eyes of the U.S. Treasury. We get reviewed and scored by the U.S. Treasury. We're not regulated like a bank, but we do get reviewed and have to compete and perform under U.S. Treasury guidelines. The Genesis Fund has been around for over 30 years. The fund itself is just over $50 million in the past year in capital. In addition to the lending, Mark and I sit on the technical assistance side. Since its beginning, Genesis has always provided technical assistance and guidance to individuals, community groups, nonprofits, for-profits, municipalities, anybody that's interested in promoting affordable housing and community facilities. So briefly, I'm going to go through a couple of slides here about trying to get traction with get a project going in your community. This presentation is somewhat edited to be geared towards a municipality audience. So I'm really glad to have the select board here from Kennebunkport present, and we'll get right into it. Next slide. So there's some of our annual reports up front on the chair here if anybody's interested in learning more about the Genesis Fund and our history and our impact around the state and what we do, how we're organized. A lot of information in that report. It says, essentially, we raise money by borrowing from banks and other institutions, and then we loan it out to projects. Genesis is a lender, so even though we're a nonprofit, we don't have any grant funds. We can't make grants. Everything that we do in investment is through lending. The Genesis Fund works in all 16 counties, and we're also active in various contracts and specific activities in New Hampshire and Vermont. So we're expanding our footprint into all 3 states of northern New England. Essentially, we try and brand ourselves as a lender that is more flexible than conventional lending. We are willing to take more risk. We are aligned with our mission, which is to promote health and well-being and a fair economy for low and moderate income residents in every community that we work in. Every investment that Genesis makes has to reflect that mission somehow, and there's different ways to go about that. And we're also working on a policy perspective as well. All of our staff participate in policy conversations, both statewide and national level. Next slide. So briefly, these are just some of the topics. We cover this stuff in a lot of different workshops. I'm going to condense it down because we have a full program this evening. But we're really trying to do is to address what people are coming forward with in terms of their need, whether it's a community saying we need more opportunities for our workers to buy homes, or we need more apartments for our large employer to be able to retain people to stay locally, or we're trying to attract more young people to our community and they can't find a place to live. So all of those needs add up to what is pretty much a common denominator around the state, is that we are just way under supply in both for sale and for rent housing. We have not built enough collectively as a state. The demographics in the real estate market are changing. We could do a whole workshop on just the economics of that. And it has led to, coupled with the recent few years in terms of what's happened on the national economy with the pandemic, it's led to a dramatic price escalation, and the conventional market of routinely people adding units to construction companies adding units to a town is just not happening. And yet there's more demand. And we are fortunate that we live in a demand location. There's lots of people that want to live in Maine now that they've realized they can live in Maine and work in someplace else. So there's a number of factors, a long list of factors, in our opinion, contributing to the shortage of housing. But what we're also finding out is that everybody's thinking, well, somebody's going to take care of it. And now we're realizing that all those somebodies are us. We have to step forward and take care of it, from our municipality, from our local businesses, from our policymakers in Augusta. We have to take charge of this issue, or else it is really going to derail a lot of good things that we enjoy in Maine. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how to make the table a little bit more inviting for a developer to come to your community, and how to go about having a conversation about those projects or those project ideas, so that they're what you want to see as a community. And despite what may be a common misperception, a new project coming to your town doesn't show up underneath a veil and is taken off as soon as the keys are ready to go into the door locks. There's a lot of process that happens before a project is built or even considered, and you as a municipality and local residents have a lot of influence on that. And I say that because it seems like these days all we're hearing about are the instances where residents are saying, no, we don't want this and we don't want that. So we have to learn how we can be more proactive and say, we don't want that, but yes, we want this. And we have to be able to get to a place where we can accept that we need more housing development in order to solve the issues. That includes better understanding how your local government works, how your local processes are introduced and translated to average residents so they can understand the language in planning and zoning. It really is its own distinct language. If you've never read through a land use ordinance before, you might have some trouble with it unless you went to school for that. And getting that translation is really important to get a community to understand, here's what we can do in this part of town, and here's what we can do in that part of town. So it's really getting that communication, like a lot of problems that need solving, get two people talking to each other on the same language, and boy, you can really solve a lot of problems. Next slide, please. I want to stress this again for my colleagues at the other end of this table who are serving your community as your select board, to really understand and be able to share this widely and frequently, that housing development is economic development. Many communities are entirely focused on this. Galen's whole job is focused on economic development, and being able to recognize that economic development, promoting things that are going to bring vitality to your local community, include healthy housing development and a healthy real estate community in your town. It's really important to know that even if things seem like they're going fine, your community, no matter where you are, whether you're in Kennebunkport or you're in Farmington or you're in Machias, you need to be adding more housing units to your town. There is a dramatic shortage of units everywhere. We need to be adding apartments, we need to be adding single-family homes, condos, townhouses, all across the spectrum, all types, need to be added to our local communities in order to meet the demand. And the challenge is that if we separate housing development from economic development, we end up making one versus the other, and they really have to work in conjunction. They really have to work in parallel with each other, because you really can't have sustainable economic development unless you're adding housing units and managing your housing stock in your community. And likewise, you're not going to have a healthy housing real estate market unless you've got economic activity. One of the things I like to draw a connection to is that if you've got opportunities for people to move into your town and they can find a place to live, or they can move from one part of your town to another part as their life changes, those people feel good about being in your community, and they're going to contribute to that. They're going to be coaches on local sports teams. They're going to contribute to the art scene. They might start a small business in your town. They might work for one of the employers in your town. They have to go together. And so I try and stress that point, because often we will say, we really need this activity over here for economic activity to keep our town going, but we really don't want this housing over there, because we just don't like, for whatever reason. And you really have to see that they both are required for economic vitality. Next slide, please. We always encourage any group, whether it's a municipal group, a local government group, or a nonprofit, a for-profit, a planning group, council of governments, any of those groups that are trying to focus on housing issues, is to really start with the data. The data that is available today is still kind of mostly looking backwards, but we're now moving through the pandemic with that data so we can actually see more relevant trends about what's happening. But the real estate market today is so different from where it was in 2016 or 2018, when a lot of printed books are using for data references. Oh, this data was just from 2018. It sounds like it was a short time ago. The world was entirely different in 2018 in terms of local economy and what housing costs were and material costs, and where demographic shifts were going on. So understanding the data that's available in your town and in your region is really critical. We try and stress it's uphill in Maine because we have home rule and each town likes to think that they're taking care of their town. But from a housing perspective and housing solutions, we really have to look over the town boundary and really think in a regional term. And many employers are pulling workers from around a region. People are sending kids to schools in different parts. People are traveling to recreate. They're visiting relatives. The residents are driving back and forth over these town boundaries all the time. So your solutions have to recognize that the economy is flowing around over those town boundaries all the time as well. I'm not saying we need to dissolve town boundaries. That's not what I'm saying at all. But we have to recognize that solutions, particularly expensive solutions like new housing development, really needs to come from a regional perspective. So work with your local town neighbors and your local governments. The Council of Governments, which there's at least a dozen of them around the state of Maine, are excellent vehicles to bring that conversation together. Next slide. I really try and stress that as you're trying to figure out what you can do as a resident or what you might do as part of an organization that's trying to solve housing challenges in your community, is to really understand what's actually possible, and that starts with and usually ends with really good conversation and communications with your town. And if your town has a planner or someone in the planning office or working with your land use ordinance, that's the best place to start. And as a town government, you should really be supporting that position and that effort so that your community understands what's in your land use ordinance, so we can sort of break down the barriers of zoning language and get it out into language that everybody can understand. I'm not going to go into too much of a discussion here about what a TIF is, a tax increment financing, but it is an enhanced ability for a local municipality to use future tax revenue that you don't have now, but you might have in the future, to actually accomplish a whole bunch of things. And I would love to have follow-up conversations. If anybody has further questions, we could take 2 hours talking about TIFs. The state is recognizing how powerful these are and has enhanced the capacity of a municipality to do lots of different things with a TIF. It allows you to develop a fund within your town government to do some really important investments. It allows you to attract investments that you want, and you can then lay out those criteria. And all of that is based on future tax revenue, not today's budget. And I can't say that enough, that if you're going to be talking about how to use a TIF to bring something to your community, it's not a burden on today's budget. It's on future tax revenue that is hypothetical until you actually get something going. So I encourage you to learn more about that from both sides, from both the resident and the municipal side. And again, anytime we talk about a change, anytime there's a wooded piece of property that's now going to have development on it, people are going to react to that. There's going to be an emotional reaction of, I've been driving by this parkland or these trees for however many years, and now there's going to be an apartment building there. I don't like that, so I'm going to say no to that. But to really encourage what might be possible in your community, we really try and encourage folks to look at opportunities to develop as close to their core community as possible, where services are concentrated, where public utilities are available. You can do a whole lot more on a much smaller piece of property if you can talk about building where there's public water and sewer. I have no idea what the public water and sewer capacity is in Kennebunkport, but I encourage you, if you have it, to use that as a leverage to try and make things happen. I'm going to finish up. Next slide, please. And this is kind of a wonky model. This is my inner high school teacher coming out here with diagrams, and that triangle should be spinning if I was better at making these presentations. But we try and really break it down into elements of any project development. And this is both for municipalities to take a look at, but also for groups that are interested in getting involved in developing, is to really look at three sides of any project that have to do with the site, understand who your players are, and that includes the developer and the owner. They may not be the same person, and the long-term users of the property. If it's for sale, that would be your buyers. If it's renting property, it would be your tenants. And then the bottom leg is the financing details. Again, we could talk for a half an hour about that. Our primary focus in our workshops that we do around the state is to explain how financing from Mark's agency works to promote both small-scale development of rental units, larger-scale rental developments, and home ownership. So we have lots of details that we can share with you. These are just a couple of the topics that we cover, and I'm not going to take up any more time while we have the rest of the program to go through, but we can share these slides if anybody's interested, and we can have lots of follow-up conversations on just this model and how it can work in your community. There's an implicit understanding here that nobody does this by themselves. Anybody that's going to work on housing has to have a team around them. They have to be able to rely on diverse skills and assets, and also relationships. I can't say that enough. You really have to have a diverse team that is connected to a number of different fields in order to have a successful project. Even the best developers in our state don't come in and do the whole thing themselves. They bring a team with them, and that team is very diverse and has a lot of different skill sets. And when you can communicate with all of those partners, that's when you have a really good understanding of what the project is going to be, and hopefully that's how the community can begin to feel comfortable about it. Next slide. That's just my contact information. Again, I can make these slides available. Mark and I do this 5 days a week, so we'd love to get on a Zoom call or a telephone call or come to your community again and make the presentation. Thanks.
All right, thank you, John, for that overview of the Genesis Fund. We appreciate it. We'll move on to the next presentation. Ryan, would you like to take the floor?
Sure. Okay. Great. Well, I'll echo John's comments. Thank you to the Select Board for inviting us. Galen, thank you for the invitation as well. And thank you to the community for being here in person, and those who either are listening right now or will watch this later at a later time. It's good to be here in Kennebunkport and to be able to talk about the work that I get to do over at Avesta Housing, but also just generally about the about housing and the work that we all have to do collectively together to try to get our arms around this immense challenge that we face. Next slide, please. So Avesta Housing, for those of you who are not familiar with us, we were founded in 1972. We are the largest affordable housing developer in northern New England. We do work in both Maine and New Hampshire. Next slide, please. So I brought forward some key data points here from our perspective in our little world at Avesta. First and foremost, we have 3,084 homes that we own and manage. And at those 3,000 plus homes, we have 4,700 residents. And we have 800 additional homes in the pipeline right now that we're working on, hopefully bringing to fruition. Last year, we had 6,500 applications for our unit in one of our properties, and we only had 420 vacancies. So just amongst our portfolio, we received 6,500 applications, 420 vacancies. So 6% of the folks that contacted us, we were able to match with housing. So a very small percentage of the folks that were looking for housing at one of our properties, we were able to get into housing. We have, next slide, please. Before I get to this one, I'll just say we have a number of properties, which I'll mention in a few moments, in Kennebunk, and we had 300 applications, over 300 applications for properties in Kennebunk, and we had 7 vacancies last year at our properties there. The year before that, we had 1 vacancy. So just down the street, you can get a perspective on the challenge that we've had here in this region. So since the pandemic, the median home price, so on the for sale side, has jumped significantly. 79% increase in that median home sale price was 219,000, and now is almost 400,000. You probably, I don't know if some of you probably saw the news. New Hampshire just released their updated median home sale price last quarter, which reached $500,000. They've never reached $500,000 in New Hampshire. I was talking to a friend there this morning, and he was noting how much of the increase has occurred. I think it took them like 10 years to get to 200,000. It took them 3 years to get to 300,000. It took them 2 years to get to 400, and it took them 1 year to go from 400,000 to 500,000 in their median home sale price. Obviously, we've seen a sharp increase here in Maine as well. If we were to meet the needs of our employers and the residents in our communities who are looking for housing right now, we would need 38,500 homes to both meet the existing need and to fill jobs. I'm sure Mark might mention it in his presentation, but Maine Housing, along with the Department of Economic and Community Development and the Governor's Office, conducted a housing study last year. I believe it was at the end of last year that it was released, and it was a unique study in the sense that it wasn't just about what we need for housing. It was also about what our needs are going to be for our workforce. So it was a workforce and housing report, which I think is really unique. I don't know if other states have really done that before, because we know that there are significant challenges ahead of us when we think about our workforce and the jobs that are going to be available and the workers we're going to need to fill those jobs. And if we don't have housing, we won't be able to meet the needs of our employers. And our employers, of course, include municipalities who are looking to hire police and fire and public works employees and so on and so forth. So it's not just the private sector, but it's also the private sector that is struggling to find workers. We know Maine's demographics. We have an aging workforce. People are reaching retirement age, but they are not leaving Maine. We've seen more and more older adults choosing to stay in Maine versus the flight to places like Florida, and that is creating another unique challenge. So we aren't suddenly seeing fewer people here, but we're seeing fewer people in our workforce. We still have jobs that need to be filled, and we need to attract people to live here. Anyway, tangent, but I think an important one. We have a 2% vacancy rate in the state, which is 3 percentage points lower than what is considered healthy. So typically you want to see 5% of units available. We only have 2% of units available in the state right now. We have been permitting statewide on average 4,800 units of housing, and we need to be permitting 9,300 units of housing annually statewide to keep up with demand. And then importantly, on the rental side, the numbers are just as grim. 190% increase in rental units priced over $1,400 between 2011 to 2021. And that number also is increased if you look above 1,400, and you see these declines in rental prices below 1,400 across the board. So people are getting pinched on both sides. If you're looking to buy a home, the prices have gone up. If you're looking to rent, prices have gone up, and there's a lot of friction in the housing market. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, at Avesta, we have 82 homes in Kennebunk and 70 homes in the pipeline. We have the four properties, including Park Street School Apartments, Cousins School, Pine Bluff, and in the works is Alewife Road, which is a partnership between Avesta Housing and Kennebunk Savings Bank. You probably maybe saw that project. Kennebunk Savings Bank donated the land. They also are donating $550,000 towards construction costs, and we're going to be able to build, as a result, 70 units of housing for older adults. That was a site in an industrial zone, so it required a contract zone. Select Board sent it out to the voters in March, and voters in Kennebunk overwhelmingly supported that change from industrial to residential. I think it was nearly 86% of the vote in favor. So an overwhelming support for that project, and a great example of a business entity coming into the housing world and working with us to make something happen that's desperately needed. There are a lot of older adults who are struggling to keep up with their homes, finding a rent or even a mortgage with property taxes going up that they can afford. Next slide, please. So I used some of the questions that the select board had asked ahead of time to sort of frame out this presentation. One of the questions was, what are some of the barriers to affordable housing? Some of these are probably not surprising to any of you here in this room. Opposition from abutters, John mentioned it. That's a huge challenge. There's a lot of money and time that goes into even getting a project before a planning board or a select board, and to have a select few individuals in a community oppose a project and ultimately be successful has a lot of impacts a project in a significant way, and also impacts a willingness from a developer or from a developer to reapproach a community in the future to do a project. Financing is another big challenge, particularly acquisition costs, especially in southern Maine. We know, we've seen land, how expensive land has become. It is very costly to even acquire property, and if you're spending a ton of money to acquire property, you're not going to be able to build affordably. You're going to have to build market rate, and that's just what the market's going to command. Zoning constraints is another challenge. If you can't get the density on the lot that you need to make the numbers work, you're not going to be able to build. You're not going to be able to build affordable housing. At least you're going to build market rate units. Next slide, please. There's a question about how dense. Generally, we look for parcels that would allow us to build at least 30 units. Again, we're talking about multifamily housing in our world. Affordable multifamily housing. This may not be what Kennebunkport is looking for, but in our world, the way where we operate, that's generally the right number for the minimum number of units that we're going to develop on a parcel for it to make sense.
And Mark, sorry, are these for you to sell, or do you run?
We are building rental properties, so that they'd be rented out after they're built, and we also manage the properties, so we don't build and then leave. We build and we also do property management. That's not everyone's model, but that's our model.
Okay,
Yep.
thank you.
Next slide, please. Incentives for affordable housing in subdivisions. So I threw out some ideas here to this question. I think you could implement a density bonus that's more generous than the one that was prescribed in LD 2003. So perhaps giving greater density if there's some affordability components built in to the development. You might require a certain percentage of the units be affordable, and if they are, you get X amount of density that you would have otherwise been able to get. And that may even include allowing for an extra story on the building, depending on what kind of configuration we're talking about, whether it's subdivision with single-family homes or something else. Reduce or eliminate permitting and impact fees for affordable units. A number of communities are starting to do this, where they've given discounts on the fees that are associated with going through the approvals process if the development or the proposed project is affordable or is committed to being affordable. Municipal funding, another mechanism that's being deployed in a lot of communities. I know the city of Rockland right now is debating putting forward a housing bond, where they might basically create a fund where they would cover some of the costs for acquisition to make sure, and all of this in the context of making sure it's affordable. So maintaining that affordability and incentivizing its affordability by covering acquisition costs or providing gap financing, things like that. You could also just do that straight through a budget allocation. There could be a fee imposed on market rate units that then goes into a trust to then again, incentivize affordable housing. It could be used to cover gap funding and acquisition costs, as I mentioned. Those are generally some of the key things. I think if there's municipal funding, however it is funded, whether it's through a bond or a budget allocation or a fee imposed on market rate units, I do think it's important that the fund not be used to try to fund full projects, because I think you're not going to get the same bang for your buck as you would if you spread that over a number of projects and cover some of those costs that are harder to cover through general financing. And I won't dive into TIFs because John already introed it, but it's also I would just endorse that as an important mechanism for affordable housing development as well. Next slide, please. There was a question about, has any community really done a good job on this? I think there are a lot of examples of communities that have done some really important work around housing to make it easier to build, to increase density. But there's really only one city in the United States that has truly been successful on the housing front, and that is the city of Minneapolis in Minnesota. They are the only American city to tame inflation, and they owe their success, as Bloomberg points out, to affordable housing. They have been building a lot of housing in the city of Minneapolis. Obviously, it's a different context. Maine doesn't have a city quite as large as Minneapolis, so we're kind of all one big town. But the point is, we know that part of what's driving inflation is housing, and the way we solve that is by building more housing so we can increase supply statewide.
Brian, can I ask
Yeah.
I was at the recently held Regional Housing Summit in Portland, and it was very good. And we've got a question about the funding. Portland has a significant housing trust fund,
Yep.
and they density and marry it, a lot of this to the public transportation. But the key point was they had issued 3,000 building permits, 1,600 are completed, 400 almost completed, and the rest to be constructed. My question is, where's the funding come from?
So their housing trust fund is funded by a fee they impose on hotel development and market rate units. So basically they either require a percentage of the units to be affordable in the development, and if the developer chooses not to include affordable units, they pay a fee in lieu, and that fee then goes into their housing trust fund. And for hotels, inherently, there's no affordable units, they're hotels, so they pay that fee in lieu, and that goes into the housing trust fund, which has been fairly well funded, I would say. Around, I think maybe there's $6 million in there right now, so they've maintained a pretty decent fund. The city of Biddeford has done something similar. Around they've imposed that kind of provision around the Mill District specifically, but they also negotiated with a developer last year who was proposing a pretty significant development on Route 111 up near Target, and they were able to get a fee in lieu of affordable units that funded the trust fund, and that money has gone to a project that Biddeford Housing Authority is doing. So it's helped cover some gap financing, which is a great use of the fund, is to not pay for a full project. It would never the fund would never probably be able to make that happen given the cost to construct, but to be able to come through and provide that gap financing that makes or break a project from being able to reach completion is really important.
Thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And that's all for new builds? Like,
New
So for
builds.
example, a new hotel going up?
Yep,
that-
exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah, not imposed on existing structures, but anything new. Yep. Next slide, please. So there was I forget exactly the question that framed this slide, but if you assume construction costs are largely the same statewide, which they are, the biggest factors for whether or not affordable housing is able to move forward is acquisition costs, as I mentioned before, rent levels. They differ
obviously
around the state, and Southern Maine obviously rents are higher, so it is more favorable to build housing here, and whether or not the zoning allowances are going to be compatible with the density that you need, as I've mentioned before. And then I would also say the degree of the degree of ease of working with city or town staff, elected leaders in the community. Again, I think your reputation can sometimes precede you, and if there's a reputation of it being difficult to bring a project to completion, it just doesn't make financial sense to even bother to put together a proposal, because there are so many costs to just getting a proposal before a community. And so to spend that time, to spend that money in a community that has a reputation of not being welcoming, frankly, it's probably going to be less likely you see development. And I think a conversation like this is really important to opening that door, and to be, I think to John's point, being able to be proactive and reach out to folks in the industry to say what you're looking for, so that the conversation is starting from a point of expectation versus kind of flying blindly as to what the community actually wants to see built and what needs they're trying to meet. And so I think this is a great forum for this conversation, and I hope that the town will be able to find the right solutions to the challenges that are facing either businesses or just residents who would like to see their kids be able to come back and call Kennebunkport home again. I think this was my last slide, but I'll say last slide just in case. Oh, growth caps. Yes, the last slide. There was a question about whether growth caps have impacted development. We at Avesta, we have experience only in one community where we've done a project where they have had a growth cap, and that was Scarborough. We were able to build that project without any issues as a result of the growth cap. Scarborough staggers their growth cap so that it doesn't actually impact or delay any projects that are in the pipeline. So our experience was that the growth cap didn't have an impact in our case, but I do know that Falmouth also has a growth cap, and I think in 2021 they reached their growth cap maximum in like the middle of the summer, and so they weren't permitting any new projects after like June or July. So I think it can have some negative consequences if you are trying to spur development, but generally it didn't have an impact in the case in Scarborough.
So Ryan, I was just trying to get an understanding of the 30 to 40 houses that you're saying in general, that's what or units that you put up. I was just trying to get an idea of the acreage that would be sitting on in general. I know, acquisition costs are different in each town, so there's puts and takes, but just rough, back of the envelope.
Yeah, so we're working on a project in Biddeford right now that is it's a 46-unit building, and the density we looked for that project was 1,500 square feet per unit. So the math, I don't really think it's
But that's
yeah.
That's not acreage.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that kind of density, helps immensely with being able to get a project to completion. I think that project's probably on just under an acre, if I remember correctly. It might be like.
And how many units is that?
46 units. Yeah.
So it's a multi-story, obviously.
Yes. Yeah. It's a 4-story building.
4-story.
Yeah. Yeah. It's across from the hospital in Biddeford.
And Ryan, for Avista's business model, do you do a combination of market-based if you get into that situation, or is it always all affordable?
Some projects have market rate, but not a lot of them. Mark can probably dive into this more from the main housing perspective, but it gets more complicated in the conditions because of the funding sources, which are largely federal and state. That it's a little more challenging to add market rate units into those projects.
Okay, so Avista is more just affordable?
Yeah, mostly, 60% of AMI and below, which for York County, I think is $42,000 for a single family household.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
So Brian, thank you for the overview and presentation for Avesta. I wanted to follow up on one of the questions about the greatest barriers facing new affordable housing projects in Maine. We'd like to know, is there a difference on the coast of Maine for coastal communities versus interior Have you noticed there's specific challenges related to coastal affordable housing in your experience? And again, either one of the panelists can chime in, any of them. Yeah.
I mean, yes.
Okay.
But I mean, I think there are differences in the sense that the needs are different in every community. I think, you know, some communities are in need of workforce housing. Some communities are in need of housing that's going to allow older adults in their community to age in place and not have to leave the community they've lived in for 30, 40 years and find somewhere else to live because they can't afford to live there anymore. I mean, the common denominator between all these communities is there is a need for housing. And I think that's pretty much universal and very much a common issue shared by all of our municipalities at this point. And again, I think even from if you exclude private sector businesses from this conversation, I mean, I talked to municipal leaders from across the state that there's a huge challenge with recruiting and retaining employees just within municipal governments. You know, see municipalities moving to 4-day work weeks and trying to find ways to solve the challenge. I know an anecdote that is now being commonly used is the city of Rockland trying to hire a police chief. They did this, you know, search. They identified a candidate. They offered him the job. He accepted the job. Tried looking in the Rockland area for months and could not find a house that he could afford. And it not only in Rockland proper, but in surrounding communities, and had to basically ultimately turn down the job. And so when we think about the future of the services we all expect our communities to provide us, fire, police, public works, education, teachers, and bus drivers, we're facing some real challenges, and housing seems to be one of the common denominators.
Okay. All right, Mark, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Galen. Thank you to the board for inviting us here today. Really excited to talk to Kennebunkport again and give you my views on housing and the state of housing in Maine right now. These two gentlemen have covered a lot of information, and so some of my spiel has been taken care of. So hopefully this will be a little shorter and less painful. So my name is Mark Wiesendonger. I'm the Director of Development at Maine Housing. Maine Housing is a quasi-governmental agency. We are not a state agency, contrary to what many people believe. We were formed by the state, and our board serves at the pleasure of the governor, but we make our own money. We fund ourselves. We're a $2+ billion bank. We do a lot of lending and bonding. We actually have a better credit rating than the state of Maine. So we're largely funded on our own. That is until recently. We've been very fortunate to receive some funding from the legislature. First time in our 50+ years. We got a direct appropriation, which has gone directly into our housing programs. So we're very thankful for that. We enjoy a great relationship with the legislature and the governor's office, and it has served us very well as of late. Maine Housing is involved in just about anything related to housing, affordable housing, rental housing, home ownership in the state of Maine. If you want information about our single-family home programs, our weatherization programs, energy programs, things like that, I can get you more information, but my department, the development department, we fund affordable rental housing projects. And that's largely what we've been talking about today anyhow. And I would say that our bread and butter program is the low-income housing tax credit program. You've probably heard of that. And when we're talking about larger rental properties, 30 to 40 units, as Ryan was mentioning, is kind of our smallest size projects. Those are usually funded with a low-income housing tax credit. And those projects are for people who are at or below 60% of area median income. A lot of people like to label housing, sorry, I'm blowing into this. A lot of people like to label housing as being either affordable or workforce or market rate. I think it's a little dangerous to use the term workforce housing and not include affordable housing because it implies that the people that live in our properties aren't working, and that's absolutely not true. What did you say, the 60% of? $42,000? Well, my wife's a teacher. And I can tell you, teachers don't make a lot of money, and a lot of them qualify for affordable housing. Also, new EMTs, new firefighters, new cops. In a lot of communities, these folks qualify for affordable housing. So I just want to put that out there when we're talking about workforce versus affordable. They're often the same thing. So the low-income housing tax credit program is our bread and butter. It's our flagship program, but we also have a lot of other programs for a lot of other purposes. We serve the whole state from Fort Kent to Kittery. We try to help every community as best we can. There are a lot of different needs around the state of Maine. It's not the same. They're different communities. They have different people doing different things with different incomes. The housing stock looks very different in different communities. So we're trying to find ways to create programs that work in different places. Somebody asked earlier about oceanfront or coastal towns. We created a program recently that was specifically for islands because on the islands, obviously it's very difficult to create housing, and the expense of getting contractors out there and workers out there is pretty dramatic. So we had to come up with something that was a little different and didn't have our usual requirements. So somebody could say, hey, my buddy Jimmy's going to come over with his tractor and dig a hole to make this, help us create this house. And we had to be comfortable with that. And most of our programs were not comfortable with that. And that's just one example of some of the creative things that we've tried to do recently. A new program that we're very excited about and that a lot of people seem to be very interested in is the Rural Affordable Rental Housing Program. This program is designed to create 5 to 18 units of affordable housing for renters up to 80% of area median income, so a little bit higher level. The program was designed to work in places where the low-income housing tax credit program may not be the best solution because perhaps there wasn't enough need, so there wasn't the scale required for the low-income housing tax credit program. It has a lot of fixed costs. And if you don't spread it over 30 to 40 units, it's not going to work. Additionally, in a lot of parts of the state, the rents are so low that even with tax credits and paying debt and the subsidy that Maine Housing can offer, rents are so low that they still can't afford to build their projects. So the rural affordable rental housing has a lot more subsidy going into each individual unit. It's proven to be very popular throughout the state. It's not always rural. I think people in Portland love to use it. I'm not sure how I feel about that. I think we could put another low-income housing tax credit in Portland pretty easily, but it's a solution. It's a smaller scale solution that works in a lot of areas and a lot of people find very favorable. It's also far less complicated than a low-income housing tax credit project, but I'll leave that to John Egan to discuss with you. I should point out that Maine Housing recently had a technical assistance RFP that we put out, and the Genesis Fund was the winner of that contract. And so when people ask me about how do I create affordable housing in my local community, I usually say call John Egan at the Genesis Fund.
And they do.
And they do. And it's worked out or Mark Primo at the Genesis Fund, and it's worked out very well for us. Maine Housing has a lot of expertise, but we're busy funding projects. We're busy doing the things that we do every day. We can't hold the hands of developers, especially new developers, and walk them through the process of applying to us for funding. So this technical assistance contract has been very beneficial to both us and developers around the state. I think John and Mark and crew do a really good job of also vetting developers for us before they come to us. And and setting them up for success. So we're really thankful. And should you know any developers that are looking to create housing, send them to John Egan. As I said before, the need in every town is very different. I think in order to be successful, to meet the needs of your citizens, the first step is doing exactly what we're doing tonight. You know, having the conversation with some experts, these guys are the experts, engaging with the citizens, trying to figure out what it is that people think they need, trying to let folks know what affordable housing is, what real estate development really looks like, what it really costs. It makes a huge difference. I've been involved in several municipal meetings in the last couple of years, especially in towns where there was a pushback on specific projects. And while I won't go to a town and say, you should build this project, we try to, you know, remain unbiased and not necessarily support specific projects. I'll go to a municipality and talk about how our programs work. And oftentimes I find that the citizens think certain things about our programs that aren't true. For instance, that real estate developers are going to get rich overnight using our programs. That's just simply not true. We want them to make enough money to be interested in the programs and to ensure the quality of the project in the long term. So they're entitled to a profit. They also take huge financial risks to do this work. So we need to pay them, but we're not going to make them rich. They can make a lot more money in doing market rate units. Additionally, I recently had somebody tell me, well, I just don't want any of that Section 8 housing in my town. And I don't think they've created new Section 8 housing in 40-something years. And Section 8 today means vouchers. And vouchers are a very good thing for any project because it means that the owner is getting paid and that the tenants are going to be able to stay in place and that the owner is going to have the funds required to ensure that the property is well maintained in the long term. And I guess, you know, I encourage anybody here, if you think there's a specific need in the town of Kennebunkport, or you have questions about what Maine Housing can do in our programs, I encourage you to reach out to me directly. I'm happy to hand out some business cards after this conversation. But we're not going to tell you what you need to do. We'll provide you information if you ask for it, but it's not up to us to decide what Kennebunkport needs. Excuse me. What Kennebunkport needs. It's up to Kennebunkport to tell us what they need. And we do listen to what our municipalities tell us. We do change our programs and cater to the needs throughout the state. And I don't want to build everything in Portland, Maine. I also don't want to build everything in Washington County. I'd be happy to have one project in Washington County right now. But we're trying to meet the needs of all Mainers, and it is very diverse. We currently have about 85 multifamily rental projects in our pipeline, something about 3,500 units, $1.5 billion. We have a lot going on. We're very fortunate to have had recently a lot of money available for these programs. We're going to need more. We need a lot more housing. Ryan was talking about the recent housing study that was done, and I believe today, I was told today there was supposed to be a release of a website where people can access that housing study. I'm not sure if it came online today or not. But I encourage you to look at it, and if it isn't out today or you can't find it, please shoot me an email and I'll send you the information. But the last number I heard is that we need about 80,000 units by 2030 to serve the needs of Mainers today. And some of that's immediate affordable housing that's needed throughout the state. But as both these gentlemen were speaking of earlier, we need more workers in Maine. We need more workers in Maine simply to build more affordable housing. we need more workers in Maine to build more affordable housing so we can lower the cost of building affordable housing and create more affordable housing. It is somewhat circular in its need, but it's real, and we do need it. And Jackson Labs and LL Bean and Sugarloaf and all these big companies throughout the state of Maine are always telling us how they need more housing. And we'd love to help them. We'd also love for them to give us some money to help us do it. But the need is universal. It's throughout the state, and it's definitely here. And we've done some work here recently, but probably not enough.
Hey,
So-
Mark, the study that you that you guys have referenced a couple times, is there any part of the study that addresses specifically the boomer impact? So the aging boomer population, and then what's that tipping point, or is there a tipping point? So all of a sudden we go from a propensity for workforce housing right now to, you know, maybe, I'm just making stuff up, but say we're looking 60% has to be workforce housing, and then within 5 years, 80% of stuff going in has to be, you know, senior complexes. Is that study include that kind of stuff? I just.
Pretty sure it does.
Yeah, it does have some information about demographics and how they're changing over time. And yes, the boomers aging out of the workforce and also boomers downsizing are a huge factor here. We, in general, in my programs, we try to create half of our housing for families and half of our housing for older Mainers. And most of our partners have been moving towards housing for older Mainers recently. And it seems to be much more popular with local municipalities because they see the need. It's great.
And do we, and just one more question before Galen goes to the general ones. When we've been talking about it in our town, and we've been watching other towns implement things, as you know, we've talked about here tonight, who addresses how the towns are set up? For example, infrastructure, specifically roads. So when you talked about your island example, right? Well, if you look at us, we're sort of bounded by the ocean. We've got small roads. We're different from Kennebunk. We're different from Arundel. You know, we actually don't have any main drags. So do you give guidance, or even does a Vista look at this? I mean, who puts that hat on within, or is it the municipality that has to wear that hat?
That's more, and actually these folks probably know more about it than I do, but that's really more of a municipality and MDOT concern. Certainly, project sites that have infrastructure available, good roads, good access to water and sewer and electricity, these things are very important. And the easier it is to get to those things, the less expensive the project's going to be.
Right.
And oftentimes, municipalities will help a project by providing funding to extend infrastructure to the project site.
Okay.
One thing that towns often like to do is offer up a derelict property or a recently closed school. That's a very common scenario for the development of affordable housing. And we have a saying in my shop that sometimes free is way too much. An old, 100-year-old school that's made of brick and maybe crumbling and has big wide open spaces and no insulation, a giant gym, and a 100-year-old oil burner is probably not going to be a good starting point for affordable housing.
The asbestos.
Yeah, I won't even get into dangerous materials that are going to have to be removed. Sometimes a free site isn't enough. There are other things that need to happen, and oftentimes the town can help with that in many ways.
I'll just add, there's two other things for municipality to take advantage of, and that there are lots of professional planning consultants who can help the municipal function, which may be limited in terms of staff capacity or time or, just getting to it on your desk. there are lots of consultants who can help take a look at those converging dynamics of transportation and housing density and where you want to see growth. And there is absolutely, and it's not wishful thinking, but if you can actually get the convergence right between transportation and density and housing and village support and amenities, it is proven that more and more people that move there don't need to have a car, or the household can get by with one car instead of two cars. And that is the fastest way to take volume off of your roads and be able to preserve a rural road network without having to build some 4-lane, Florida version where there's turn lanes on both sides and a median, and you know what that looks like. So there's lots of good planning out there and good examples of how small rural towns can work on really concentrating amenities and residential and commercial activities in a village core. And people don't need to have two cars like they do when they live 4 miles out of town.
And the only thing I'll add is, not that I want to offer this up, but we have done projects where we have built out public infrastructure in order to make the project happen. So the recent example, we did a project in Conway, New Hampshire. New Hampshire DOT required for their approval an expansion of the road in front of the project, and we footed the bill to make that happen. But, it's one of those things where it's dollars coming away from an affordable housing project to pay for a road. So it's one of those trade-offs where you have to reconcile that state dollars or federal dollars are being used to build housing, and most transportation dollars are federal dollars. And so you're basically taking one federal dollar for another. But nonetheless, we have done it. I think if there's a need in the community to build out infrastructure to make a project viable, I think those are conversations that I'm sure folks would be willing to have and figure out what the numbers look like and see what are the costs to upgrade infrastructure to make a project viable that otherwise wouldn't be because of what's around it.
Much of what we've been discussing is centered around rental units. What experience do you have in developers, or which you can speak to developers working at maybe a quarter acre, or I don't sure my size, but more dense community that might have some interspersed a small grocery store, a coffee shop, a barber shop, but a neighborhood community where there's a mix of affordable and marketplace. Is anything like that out there, or been done, or do you support, et cetera?
Yeah, there's a lot of mixed income properties out there. In the low-income housing tax credit program, these are primarily in Portland and Lewiston, where the rents from the commercial space are going to justify the cost of the construction. Also, we do have mixed income projects where we mix market rate. Avesta is a good example of one of those developers. We mix market rate units in with affordable units, and it actually creates better outcomes for the people that live there. So we definitely encourage that. It doesn't work everywhere. It would work here with the rents as high as they are, because the market rate units can't be subsidized. So they have to be able to afford themselves, essentially.
But again, that's a rental scenario you're speaking of.
Yes. Yep. And one more thing I'll point out is, we're talking a lot about who pays for what. And the reality is, 3 hours ago, Ryan and I were at an Avesta project grand opening in Portland. And it took 5 years to come to fruition. And part of that was due to it starting right around the time COVID came around. And escalating construction costs over time that did a number on it. But there were 12 different sources of funding that went into that project. It's great to apply to our programs, and that is going to be the bulk of the funding in many cases. But, we do rely strongly on municipalities and federal grants and the Federal Home Loan Bank of Boston and a lot of other sources to make these projects come to fruition. And, 5 years ago, $150,000 per unit for affordable housing was pretty common. Now, $350,000 per unit is pretty common. So we haven't received that much more money since then. So we really need other people to come in and help support these projects as well. It can be a little convoluted and confusing sometimes, but when a lot of people come to the table, I think ultimately the projects come out a lot better too.
Mark, do you want to mention the home ownership program?
Oh, yes, sorry. I did not mention the Affordable Home Ownership Program. This program used to be called the Subdivision Program years ago, but it's maybe not the best name for it. The last iteration of the subdivision program, I believe we did a project in Kennebunkport, though, not too far from here. And Tom Clancy and crew, the Kennebunkport housing here. I mean, Pat Clancy, Tom Clancy. I'm ready to go to bed and read my book. Yeah, the Kennebunkport Housing Heritage Trust built a project using the subdivision program. And essentially what that is we provide developers of subdivisions, and a subdivision could mean condominiums, connected properties. A minimum of 5 units on the same site. We provide a certain amount of subsidy per unit to the developer so that they will create home ownership opportunities and sell the properties at lower cost. So essentially, we are subsidizing them so they reduce the selling price of the projects. The last version of this program, we were offering up to $70,000 per unit in York County, with a maximum sales price of $325,000. That was 2 years ago. And so we have just received some money from the state to continue the program. We will put out a new program soon. Those numbers are probably going to change rather dramatically. And these properties can be sold to people making up to 120% of area median income.
And those are deed restricted for so many years to limit?
Yes.
They have a 30-year.
I'm sorry, I missed the.
Deed restricted.
15.
15 years?
Oh, it's
15 years, Mark's telling me.
it's longer than that for ours, but that's I believe
Main program.
for Heritage Woods.
No, for the
Oh.
main.
Okay, go ahead.
So different groups put different requirements on
Yeah.
top of ours.
That's their requirement.
Right, for 15 years, the homeowner can resell the property at up to 85% of our first home loan program limits.
Say that one more time.
Yeah, for 15 years, any resale of the property, the purchase price cannot be more than 85% of the limit that we have on our first home loan program. So we have a first-time home buyer program called the First Home Loan Program. This is not necessarily connected to that. You can use that program to purchase these units, but it's not necessary.
Okay.
But in order to justify putting this subsidy into these units
Yeah.
and to make sure that people don't buy these properties at a lower price and just flip them,
Right.
we limit how much they can sell them for.
So you
for up
just
to
sort of
15 years.
connected to another program, even though it wasn't really involved in it, just to give, I get.
Yes, it's just a number that already exists.
Yep.
That makes sense.
And just to be clear, we do have, as you know, with the Heritage Woods, we do have affordable housing mechanisms in place to do exactly the same thing. It's just a different mechanism, so
Right.
people shouldn't confuse the two.
So after 15 years, they're able to go ahead and sell them for whatever price they can get for them?
Correct.
Under that scenario.
Under that,
There
and
are
I
other
don't remember what,
scenarios. That's
right.
not the case
Heritage Woods
for
might
our
have some
affordable
different
housing.
rules.
That we are building now, the Heritage Woods, just want to make that clear.
Our requirements have been met at that point.
So you would
whatever
say
our
that those are the minimum state requirements for the state, given that type of money, and then like the Heritage Trust or any other can put their own higher restrictions on top of that?
Correct.
And it has to do with the land, obviously, that's the difference.
As long as it meets fair housing requirements.
Yep.
Like you couldn't exclude a protected class or something to that
Right.
effect.
Okay, well, thank you for the overview, Mark. I appreciate it. I have a few questions here, and just to get the conversation going. We had a good conversation about funding sources and making a project work. Could you briefly give an overview of if a developer comes to you, or if you're looking at a property, what factors you're taking into consideration when you're doing a deep dive? And what are you reflecting on in order to either make an investment successful or the project successful and sustainable in the long term? Could you give an overview of what you're looking at?
These guys are looking down.
I'm definitely going to kick this to John because this is, it's really what we have a contract with them for.
That's what we pay them for.
This is why I'm paying them, so I don't have to answer questions at these meetings.
Right, so we work with a lot of developers, small scale, builders who want to become developers, professional developers who've done nothing but market rate and now want to do some affordable. So we see the full spectrum of that, and that many times a developer will come to us for a conversation or come to a site in a municipality already knowing what they think they want to build. And they haven't had one conversation with the town yet about what the town wants to see there. So there's one, developers sometimes get a bad rap. So there's one place where people will say, yeah, they don't ever listen. Well, it's because they really haven't had a chance to talk yet. So rather than seeing it as the developer's not listening, take it as this is a great chance to inform the developer about what we'd like to see. So open those conversations, but if you talk to the developer, very quickly in that conversation, you're going to hear about risk, and you're going to hear about how much money do I have to put out the door before I start seeing it coming back. And if it's a for sale project, how long am I going to be building my units before I can start selling them and taking the proceeds from each sale and using it to start or to keep building the others. Their lender is also going to be asking those questions. If it's a rental project, they're going to say, if they're going to own it themselves, like an Avesta would, how long is it from when I come forward to put a contract down on the land to take site control, acquisition, purchase and sale, or an option agreement, how long from that day until I'm actually moving people in? And what are the risk potholes, maybe the risk Grand Canyons in between those two things that I might fall into, that my project might fall into? So the developer is looking outside of what other developers in this community may have experienced, and they're taking notes. They're talking to their subcontractors or their builder to find out if I have to make a modification and I have to go down to 1 story and go out, or I have to go to 3 stories and go up, what does that do to my cost? Again, they're coming forward usually with a pretty good idea of what they want to build on that site. That's what brought them to that site. Oh, I can put up whatever. I can put up townhouses, I can put up single-family homes, I can renovate this mill. They're going to come to that conversation with some element of feasibility already in mind. So knowing that, ask that question. Well, what are you thinking about? Here's what we'd like to see as a community. We want to see 3-bedroom units because we're trying to encourage more families to live in this part of town. We want to see small units with lots of amenities and fully accessible common areas because we really want to get older Mainers into these units, or whatever the conversation might look like. So that's a great opportunity to sort of line up what the developer is already thinking and what you want as a community. I think absolutely right after they ask the question about risk and how long of a time frame my money is going to be out the door before I start feeling comfortable about it, is the numbers are always tight. And with escalating material costs, they seem to have slightly leveled off a little bit, but labor shortages are still driving labor costs higher by the month, by the quarter. So they're going to ask, I need to hedge against that. If you're telling me it's going to take 18 months to go from here to here, my costs that I'm starting with today that pencil out, and I've already talked to my banker, and they're willing to make me the loan, those aren't gonna hold for 18 months. So I have to have some kind of a hedge, and so they're gonna say, what can I get for an extra density? Because if I can take that land cost and that infrastructure and the water and sewer improvements, and the general envelope and foundation of the building, and do 20 units instead of 10, my numbers are gonna work dramatically better. So what can I do with density? And does an increase in density absolutely always require an increase in parking? Ask those questions. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. If you're in close to town, many people moving into town by choice are willing to give up their second car. And so maybe you don't need 2 spaces per unit, per project, in a project. And then I think the third thing they're gonna wanna know is, I read the news story about, Bob Smith, who was here 2 years ago and spent 5 meetings in front of the planning board and eventually got killed. And then the town will say, yeah, well, that's because Bob Smith was building, 8-sided purple, whatever, and nobody liked the way it looked. So get that conversation about, here's what we're expecting in our community. Please bring us a design that doesn't look like it came from Mars, and we'll do our best to try and get our community warmed up about it. And developers increasingly are recognizing they have to go out and talk to the community before they bring that project to the planning board. They have to bring friends to those public meetings, not just the enemies. So that's, I think, the key drivers that the developer is bringing to the conversation when they first show up.
And then I guess we did have a conversation briefly, and I believe it was in your presentation, Ryan, about density. How do we use density to increase affordability while preserving the acceptable sense of the rural character or the sense that we have as a community? What steps can we make to?
And could you address density not in a high-rise rental building, but in single-family homes? How do you work the density issue to make a neighborhood rather than a set of high-rises?
I don't know what single-family home builders are looking for.
Density, density has, if you're selling the units and not renting them, density has everything to do with, I'm gonna spend this box of money on this infrastructure, and I need to, my zoning tells me I can sell 10 units. I need to be able to sell 15 in order to make it work.
And it's got to be a mix. You got to have the market with the affordable, I would think.
Right. Starting with your land use ordinance about dwelling unit per acre, minimum lot size, setback size, street frontage, all of those criteria drive what your projects look like in your community. I don't know how many, in my town in Freeport, where I live, we go to neighborhoods and we say, why can't we have a neighborhood that looks like this? Right. You pull out your land use ordinance and you say, this neighborhood would never comply with our land use ordinance today. It doesn't have this minimum lot size. It doesn't have this street frontage. The houses are too close together. There's a difference in height. We want continuity. And so our best efforts to try and improve our land use ordinance have ended up creating something that it just looks like the 5-acre, 1 house per 5 acres on the outskirts of town. Right. So when you talk about density, it is a negotiation, and you want to say to the developer, our current land use allows, let's say, 6 units per acre. That's a reasonable number for single-family homes. And if they're going to be close together, then you can say, well, we can give you a little bit more density, or we might actually help you pay for some of that water sewer infrastructure if you go 2 more units and make those affordable. Or you put ADUs on a couple of those houses so that we're creating a rental unit and a home ownership unit. We've now created 2 dwelling spaces, one's owned, one's rented. So there are some tools to do that. I also encourage, there's lots of good examples in various communities that I did one, it was a while ago, it was about 10 years ago in Auburn, and you use a zoning tool called a planned unit development, and it allows you to bring units much closer together, probably even touching, but not have a condominium, and have the unit and the ground underneath it sell and be described legally as a standalone, single-family home. That's much easier to finance than a condo, and actually can bring your density pretty close together, if not actually touching. And it's, in some places, it's called a zero-line setback. Other places, it's called planned unit development. There's lots of lingo for it, but essentially, it's selling the house and the earth underneath it, which is what a lender wants. They want that mortgage to be as plain vanilla, so that tomorrow, by 10 o'clock in the morning, it's out in the secondary market someplace, and they get their money back, and they can keep lending. And in a condo, particularly in a new condo that has affordable units, the initial lending on those condos is gonna be uphill, because that condo lender doesn't wanna be the first one into a brand-new condo association that has 6 affordable first-time home buyers. They're not sure that condo association is gonna be around 8 months from now. So they're gonna say, well, we'll loan you this money all day long next year. Come back and show us the condo association minutes of meetings that you've had, so we know it's up and running. So if you can avoid the condo on a brand-new thing, it can actually make the financing go smoother, and that can help get the project going faster, and that can help bring the developer in to build the ownership units that you're looking for.
You talking structures like the ones at Scarborough Downs? Zero, they're right,
The
connect.
row houses.
Yeah, row houses.
Row houses, yeah.
That's a model. I've not seen what's at Scarborough Downs recently that they've been built, so I can't say that, but it would be a unit that is very close, if not touching, to the one next to it.
Be like a duplex, but
Yeah.
for sale. Yeah. I'll just throw another fun idea that's a bit different. I'm not sure any community in Maine has done this, but I follow a national developer blog, and there's a really interesting concept that they threw out there, which would base the density on the square footage used by each of the individual homes that are built versus setting the density on a per unit basis. So essentially, let's just say you had a 40,000 square foot lot, the town would say the cumulative total of your buildings can equate to 20,000 square feet. However many units that is up to you, whether you're building 20 1,000 square foot units or 10 2,000 square foot units, we don't care. Just you have to stay within that square footage in terms of the footprint and the lot coverage of that 40,000 square foot parcel. So another interesting way to look at it versus looking at it on a per unit basis, looking at it on a usage basis. Yeah.
If I could just ask the panelists, the other thing that I'm aware of is that we've got a number of developers in the state who take that kind of creative approach to looking at sort of a little pocket neighborhood and what the mix of market rate and affordable housing could be in different form factors of buildings. And I know that this group, works with a lot of those same folks, and it might be a useful exercise to hear from some of those developers around the state. I'm thinking about people like Developers Collaborative and Brian Eng and Carol Wilbur. There are folks who are taking that kind of approach to say what is appropriate and will work in Maine communities that might be outside of this form of a big building with 3 stories and a bunch of apartments. And I think that's the tension that I'm hearing in your question, John, if I can interpret a little bit. And saying, is there a mix of types of building, and is there a mix of market rate and affordable units, and how might that look? Is that
Right,
correct?
no, exactly.
Yeah. I'll just add as an anecdote, I'm in this, right? I do this, I've been doing it for 35 years, and I'm involved with my local town government. We had a consultant come in to help us with a downtown vision in Freeport 3 years ago. And after a lot of meetings and lots of drawings, we had a series of public hearings, and we had stuff up on the wall, renderings of what a particular street in downtown Freeport might look like. And you vote with the yellow dot, right? So everybody said, this is what we want. And then we took it off the wall, and we came to the council, and we was like, there's no way that we can do this with our current land use ordinance. It violates this. So that was the aha moment for the rest of the council and our planning board to have a conversation about, okay, we just found out exactly what the community wants, and we can't do it in our downtown. And so we've now opened up the can on everything, and we're rewriting it so that those things that people have already voted with their feet, we want to see more of this. We want to see more mixed-use activity. We want to see residential and commercial in the same building. We don't want to see anything higher than 4 stories. We now have that data from our community, and now we have to fix our land use ordinance and our zoning codes.
It's form-based zoning, right?
It
I
is.
mean,
It's getting that towards that. Yes, it is.
And I'll just mention quickly, I think it's June 5th and 6th this year.
Build Maine.
The Build Maine Conference is coming up in Skowhegan, and really, what happens there is people talk about creative ways to look at housing and development and what municipalities can do to assist with that. And there's been there are some pretty far out crazy ideas there, but also there are some real world, real time examples of things that you can do that really provides a lot of ideas for a lot of people. It's pretty exciting.
Okay. Final question that I don't think was answered. So do affordable housing projects consider smart growth principles of locating these types of developments in areas where there's existing public transportation systems, example, bus, rails, passenger rail service, especially for people who may not have a automobile. And then for rural towns without a robust transportation system, can an affordable housing project be successful in integrating new residents into the community?
I'll answer the first one, and it's easy because the short answer is yes. Because almost all, in fact, I think all of the programs at Maine Housing that are funding 95% of affordable units in Maine all either require or give you lots of points if you're competing for those smart growth, amenity-rich location points. That's been going on for 12 or 15 years.
Sometime, and there's actually 15 points in the low-income housing tax credit program out of 100 for smart growth principles.
Right. So that's already happening, and that is part of what is drawing higher density projects towards the center of a community, because that's usually where the resources that you just mentioned are located: infrastructure, water, sewer, utility, commercial activity, transportation. If the community does not have robust public transportation, figuring out how to get some kind of means for the people that live in that building to be able to get to your community is so much easier when they can walk. And so if you build the property outside of walking distance of where people want to congregate, where there are services, food stores, health clinics, hospitals, pharmacies, all the usual stuff, if they can't walk there, then you are absolutely demanding that they have a working car, and maybe two, because one parent is going this way and the other parent's going that way. So it's really imperative to try and look at that holistic of not just what does the building and the land use say, but what are the people who are going to live there? What do they actually need? And think about that ahead of time.
I just need to ask clarification on that one. I may have gotten lost. So there's a point system for types of loans, and so for example, just cutting to the chase here, we are a vacation town. We go to Kennebunk for our grocery store. We go to Kennebunk or Portland for our doctors, or Wells, or Arundel. So we really don't have that center that you talk about. So what does that mean for like a town like us? Does that mean that developers coming in won't be able to check all those boxes and then get some of the state monies? And we just are fundamentally different.
Yeah. You're actually not that different from a lot of rural Maine communities. And it is harder with the larger scale program that Mark mentioned, the tax credit. It is going to be difficult for a project, even in the center of Kennebunkport, to compete for that reason, is that there aren't those amenities right nearby. And so that may mean that you want to partner with Kennebunk or with Wells and work together on getting a project that's close to both communities and rely on, this is a big word sometimes, a regional approach on how to solve your issues. So that's one way to do that, but I'll flip that around and say, Galen's job will be a lot different if he's talking to year-round businesses who are concerned or asking questions about how they might locate in your village center of Kennebunkport, because now there's 40 year-round residents living in these buildings that have normally been just vacation rentals. So one feeds the other. Housing development is economic development. Economic development can thrive when there's housing development. So if you are trying to get more activity in your village center that's not entirely dependent on tourism, and I have that in my town in Freeport, we have this question all the time. How much are we steering towards our tourism economy, which is huge, and how much are we steering towards our people who live here, who we want to sustain the community? It's a balance, and you have to constantly be reweighing it. But if there's a way to get small increments where you can create spaces where, and maybe it's one building, maybe it's a building that has 10 units of rental and 2 stores downstairs, and you use your tools available to make sure those stores are for the residents year-round, a hardware store and a pharmacy, or whatever it might be, and not just for the visiting economy. Not for T-shirts.
I mean, the only thing I'll add to that is, the project we have in Kennebunk is not in the downtown center. It's not walking distance to any amenities. So in that regard, it's not going to score well on the LIHTC funding application. But there were other conditions that made that viable and made it attractive for us to pursue it. Mainly the fact that the land was $0, and that that Kennebunk Savings Bank is providing $500,000 towards construction costs. So I say that to say it's important to find locations that are close to density, close to amenities, but it's also important to just simply not write off parcels that may be viable for other reasons, because it's town-owned land and you have no use for it, and you're looking to utilize that as the solution, or it is a business partner that's coming to you saying, I've owned this land, I have no use for it, I want to donate half of it into a conservation easement, and the other half I want to use for housing. And can we work together to find a developer partner to do that work? So I think every situation is different. I think that's sort of why it's important to sort of take inventory of where in town is there some interest around housing, what are some potential parcels that make sense, what kind of project are you looking to do, and then take that inventory and then going out to potential partners to start having a conversation and envisioning what might be possible with when the rubber meets the road. And in the Kennebunk example, I mean, that's exactly what happened. A large swath of that land that they own is being put into conservation easement. Another portion is being used to extend the Eastern Trail, and then we have a small portion that's going to be used to build the 70 units of senior housing. So it was it works there because of the circumstances. It won't score well. It won't score well on the LIHTC application because it won't get those points that it would if it were near points of interest, amenities like grocery store, medical, so on and so forth. But
For less than the cost of a couple of bedrooms, though, you could bring in 2 zip cars that can be available for the community.
Yeah, there are ways to get those
Yeah, there's
points.
ways to get what
Run it
you're
and
looking
manage
for.
that,
That's a good point.
It's 15 points, and it's not all or nothing.
right.
Okay.
There are portions of it that you can get for different reasons, like on-demand transportation,
That's
for
interesting,
instance.
yeah. That's a
And-
good thought.
And we'll get points for not having to pay for acquisition. So there's
Right.
also points for acquisition costs on
Okay.
and
So it's a
and-
very big form.
yes, yeah.
And I think Ryan was making a good point in what he was just saying, in that it's really about the developer partner that you're working with, right? If you start talking to a developer partner, which is free at this point, right, just talking, they're going to know very quickly whether or not they can have a viable 9% LIHTC project in your community or on the site that you've suggested. So it's worth speaking with them about it.
Okay, and then Mark, I just have when you were going through, from a state level, is there anything with municipality workers that the state's looking at in a total thing to give support for housing?
With municipal workers?
Yeah, I didn't know if the state, because that is, like you brought up, or a couple of you brought up during your discussions, that is a statewide issue. And the pay scales are very different than industry in many areas. And I didn't know, with all the programs, if the state of Maine was actually thinking, if it was in the pipeline of thought.
I can't speak for the state of Maine, only for Maine Housing, which is technically not part of the state government.
Okay.
So I can answer that.
Okay, but in your part, you guys, not,
We provide funding simply for the construction.
okay, thank you.
So at this time, I'd like to open up to the audience. If there's any members that have questions, feel free to go to the podium and just state your name and then just ask your question for the panel. And then we'll open up if there's anyone in virtual land. How many do we have virtually?
3 at the moment.
We have 3 at the moment. Anyone have any questions for the panel?
Oh, we have thousands out of the TV.
Yeah.
I do have a question. David Bancroft from Beechwood Avenue. I'm assuming that Kennebunkport, this is kind of one of those situations where some people wouldn't think of Kennebunkport as a rural community, but do we qualify as a rural community since you brought that up?
You do.
Yes.
And the other question would be...
USDA definition.
Right. So the question is, if the town and the board decided that it wanted to pursue some of this planning and looking into the ability to deal with affordable housing in the town, which we desperately need, are there grants available to the town to actually help with this planning?
Yes.
So that's what, I mean, let's get right down to the dollars. I mean, if the
Yeah.
town wants to do it and the people want to actually kind of convene what you were talking about, can we come and ask for grant money to get a planner or someone to help us start to parse this issue together?
I don't know the status of that, of the DECD funds that,
There's still some there.
yeah.
And also SMPDC, or the Southern Maine Planning and Development Commission, would be, I think, the next step for thinking. I think Tracy Gear, I'm the state rep for Kennebunkport, and just wanted to, so the 2 sources would be the Southern Maine Planning and Development Commission, which is the entity that helped with the climate plan, et cetera. And then there might be some funds left, and I'm also the state rep, so that's something that we should definitely continue to talk about in terms of the needs for support from municipalities, both on the planning end, as well as thinking through things, just responding a little bit to Mary Beth's question, regarding integrating transportation planning, for example. If you're just thinking about housing as an individual entity, that's one thing. But if you're thinking about, gee, what would continuing the summer trolley service so people could get around and have that be a year-round thing, so people could take a bus rather than have a car, that sort of thing that would need to be integrated into a holistic approach to thinking about some of this type of housing, I think.
And just the other question from Mark. The low-income housing tax credit's 9%, is competitive, correct? Do you have a 4% tax credit option?
We do, and currently it is competitive as well.
Okay. And is it in funding rounds, or is it open? Or is it competitive with your funding?
They're both competitive, and there are deadlines at the same point each year, as long as we continue to receive funding from the state for a 4% program.
And I would just note the DECD funding program is called the Housing Opportunity Grant Program, something like that. Galen, I can send you contact information if you folks are interested in inquiring as to whether or not that funding is available.
Yeah, we had their 2 representatives here.
Okay.
Educate them.
Oh, great.
Yep.
Okay, great, awesome. Hillary and Ben, perfect. The dynamic duo.
Yes.
Yes.
Any other questions? Thoughts?
I have a thought. This was amazingly helpful. Thank you so much for
Yes, very good.
for your expertise and opening my eyes to a lot of things.
Yeah, we definitely learned a lot, right?
Yep.
Okay. With that being said, Mr. Chairman, I'll hand it over to you. Thank you again
Yeah,
for
thank you.
for the presentation. Appreciate it.
Well, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved?
All those in favor? Yep, we're done.
I can't
Meeting
vote.
adjourned. 7:50.